missionary. So the missionary in the wilderness found that things had not gone well with the tribe that he had come to convert. They were chasing him through the jungle. And as he ran through the jungle, he found himself at the edge of a cliff, and he stopped and he shouted, "Doomed." And then as the people came and gathered around him, he heard a little voice in his head that said, "Be calm. Pick up the rock that's by your foot." So he reached out, he picked up the rock, and the voice said, "Throw it at that one old man standing right there." He threw it, he knocked the old man down, and he said, "And what now?" And the voice said, now you're doomed." Right. Well, I didn't have one for today, but that one popped into my head. For today, we're going to be talking a little bit about the prehistory of North America. Now, when we think of North America before the Europeans came, we think of Native Americans. We think of people who, some of them were migratory hunters, most of them were settled farmers. We think of Native American traditions. We think of, kind of simple but sustainable agriculture. And today we're going to be talking about some of the ancestors of the Native Americans. What are some of the experiments, some of the life ways that were tried by human beings on this continent before they started, before they became the Native Americans that are most familiar to us. So we're going to be talking about some Native North American prehistory. And for my research, I'm using some material from Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. How many of us have read or encountered this book? It's all right. A People's History of the United States, I think it was first written in the 1970s, and then it has been updated every few years since then. And it's a book that really looks at history instead of what we're accustomed to, where history is kind of led and moved by leaders and generals and captains of industry and big names and heroes and those people. Howard Zinn looks at history in terms of what was the situation for kind of the average person at the time. What was life like for the people whose names are generally forgotten in history textbooks? So he gets off to a really good start by talking about some of the nameless, undocumented, some of the people who first came to this continent. He writes that when Columbus came and saw people in South America, he referred to them as Indians because he miscalculated the size of the earth. And yet, there is some reason to call them Indians, Howard Zinn says, because they did come perhaps 25,000 years ago from Asia. When Christopher Columbus called the people here Indians, he was not referring to them as people from India, but at the time, the Indies meant the East, meant all of Asia. And it's been found that the natives of North and South America seem to have originated in Siberia as hunter-gatherers who kind of crossed over a temporary land bridge, which has kind of long since melted back into the sea. Moved downward, they populated here. They kept on moving, and basically as they moved, the climate kept getting better and better, more and more agreeable. until they got to here. What is it? What is it? The climate here in South Central America is essentially the same as the climate in the parts of Africa where the human species seems to have first originated. And so thinking of this as a kind of paradise, really it was, because that was the original human habitat. And then when kind of Siberian hunters got down here, they found it to be so comfortable and so bountiful, and there was so much food that their population grew, and their population kept growing until population pressure here caused some people to relocate northward. They kind of got pushed up north because it got too packed down there. The land bridge theory is pretty widely accepted now as far as how human beings got onto these two continents. We know we don't find human remains from before that time, and there are other signs of this human species entering into this land. However, still there are some traditional Native Americans who reject this theory and insist that they are naturally of the soil. It's not because people are ignorant or uneducated. We need to think for a moment, excuse me, about how could this land bridge migration be kind of misused by European Americans? Right, good. So that when European Americans and Native Americans are arguing about things like land ownership, some European Americans could say, well, the Native Americans were also immigrants here. They also came here and kind of took over. So that could be used to, kind of take away from the Native American ownership, the Native American relationship with the land. So some natives kind of don't accept that, and really, in important ways, I think both could be true. I think that we can say that yes, genetically, the ancestors of Native Americans crossed over to here, but that also the traditions, the life ways that were formed here are very specific to this place. As we know, the way you get your food in, Siberia, like ice fishing, is not necessarily going to work as well in like Colombia, in South America. So I think in a very important way, both can be true. We can accept, yes, there seems to have been this land bridge. People do seem to have crossed over on it, but also certainly Native American traditions are very much of this place. We have kind of a myth. It's a charming myth. It's a nice myth. The myth that the Native Americans lived here without changing the environment. Could this really be factually true? It would be biologically impossible for millions of human beings to come into a place and not change it. Every time a new species is introduced into a place, there are always changes. One change we can definitely see is that the people who came from Siberia were hunters, and they were mammoth hunters. The first thing they did was they hunted all of the American mammoths into extinction. Then they worked their way down to smaller animals. Here we see this thing. It's like some kind of ram or goat. It is not here anymore. I've read that when the first human beings came here, there was some species of 300-pound beaver. So imagine for a moment a a beaver, which is already like a 40, 50-pound thing. But now imagine that it's the size of 2 adult humans. Well, whatever it was, apparently it was too delicious to last. So it got hunted to extinction. We've heard that there were no horses on this continent until the Europeans arrived. This is true. However, there had been horses before. The hunters ate them. As a matter of fact, the animals. So the animal populations, they changed a great deal. And while this was happening, while the animals that were being hunted were getting smaller and smaller. I mean, how do you hunt a mammoth? Does anybody know how you actually like kill a mammoth, a giant elephant? You wait until it's passing through some ravine or under a cliff, and you roll rocks over. And then once you've hit it with a couple of rocks, then you send people jumping over the cliff to land on this thing and stab it with spears until it's dead. As the animals that you're hunting get smaller, your hunting tools have to get smaller. So you can hunt a mammoth with big rocks. If you're hunting, like a giant ram, you would use like a spear. But when you get to the point where you're hunting bison or even rabbits and squirrels, you can't really use a spear for that. That's when you start to use sharper tools, finer tools, things like the bow and the arrow. So the animals kept getting smaller. The hunters had to keep getting smarter, and they had to keep kind of refining their hunting techniques. It was eventually found that people were not going to survive in this place entirely by hunting animals. And people were also learning about the unique plants of this place. They were also learning about gathering, foraging, which foods were edible. And a few thousand years ago, people did start engaging in some of the first experiments in agriculture, in farming. Farming can be as simple as saying, like, oh, we're a bunch of foragers, we're a bunch of gatherers. We go out into the woods, we gather things, and now we find that there's that spot that we all use as an outhouse, and now that we see that some of our favorite plants are kind of sprouting out of that. That's just the most basic form of human farming. Animals do it too. It's just when you eat seeds and then you create fertilizer, and then things start to grow. People here thousands of years ago began to grow primarily corn, which is something that it doesn't grow by itself. It needs to be, as a matter of fact, wait, let me see for a moment. Because I've got a picture in here. When the first humans arrived in the Americas, they found a plant that looked like this. It was like a wheat plant. And then over the course of thousands of years, they replanted this. They selectively bred it, they spliced it, they hybridized it, they did all kinds of experiments until thousands of years later, we get what is recognizable to us as a corn plant. Things that human beings did by working with this plant. For example, originally, the seeds of it were out in the open. And human beings, by selectively breeding, they managed to create to form something that had bigger seeds and more food, and that also grew with this natural sheath, which protects the seeds from insects and birds and some of the some of the competitors out there. We can think of this as something that human beings did to the plant. It would actually make as much sense to say that this is something that the plant kind of did in order to establish a relationship with human beings. What does the plant get out of this? If a plant keeps changing and adapting, what does corn get from us? It survives, it spreads. There is a lot more corn growing on the earth now than there was 20,000 years ago. Human beings can do other things that for the plant that the plant can't do for itself. For example, we can cut down forests. We can create space for more corn to grow. So even though we think of these things as this is something that a human being does to a plant, really, in a way, you could say that we have entered into a reciprocal relationship with the corn plant. We are still in this relationship. It does a great deal for us. We have many, many uses for corn. But also, we have become really addicted to it. We are really hooked on corn, not only corn for food, but also for oil and for, movie blood and all of these things that we use it for. So human beings entered into a relationship with this plant. Having the special relationship with this plant made it possible for human beings to settle in place, made it possible for people to start building things on their own. Howard Zinn writes, the Indians were engaged in the great agricultural revolution that other peoples in Asia, Europe, Africa were going through at about the same time. With settled communities where there was more food, larger population, more division of labor among men and women, more surplus to feed chiefs and priests, more leisure time for artistic and social work, for building houses. When you think about it, having a large, dependable food supply, and another nice thing about corn is that you can grow it and harvest it in its season, and you can dry it and store it, and then rehydrate it later. And so having that enabled people to settle. They built some of the first cities. And also, once you've got this wealth of dried corn, then the next thing you need is essentially administrators to determine how it gets divided, how it gets shared, how it gets stored. You need accountants to decide who is going to get how much of it. You end up actually pretty quickly with complex bureaucracies. So we can think of things like large-scale farming and bureaucracy and hierarchy, division of labor, royalties, priests, kings, all of that stuff. I assume that we're pretty familiar with how those things grew up in the ancient Near East, in places like Babylon, which we might think of as the cradle of civilization, even though civilization experiments were happening in numerous places at that time. We probably have some sense of what that looked like in ancient Egypt. Here in North America, there were also large-scale experiments with city building, food production, and food storage, and in kind of monumental architecture. So at about the same time that the Egyptians and Babylonians were building their big cities and their pyramids, natives of New Mexico were conducting similar experiments, and they were building things in some ways the same. We can look at this North American cliff city We can clearly recognize it as a public works project. We can easily recognize that there was that it required administration, that it required some kind of hierarchy, some kind of people who had the authority to say, now we are all going to build this thing. In those ways, we could say that it is like ancient monuments from other cultures. But it's also very different. How would we say that this one on the bottom right is different from these other ancient monuments?
Structure to bring adulation or whatever, adulation to someone.
Good. Yes, excellent. These three are clearly built for religious purposes. Whereas this one down here is an apartment complex. It's made for people to live there. How many people lived in the Great Pyramid of Giza? That would be 0. The pyramids were built for dead people. Matter of fact, you would build a whole pyramid for one dead person. Unfortunately, it meant that their spouse and closest friends would probably be, killed and forced to accompany them in case they still needed like service in the afterlife. These pyramids in South America and Babylon, these were built for sacrifice. They are human-made mountains that are made for people to to burn offerings, to feed sky gods. So this one major difference, it is a place for people to live. We might notice that 3 of these here are triangles. They're pyramids. And we know from studying the Mayans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, that these places not only had physical pyramids, but they also had social pyramids. They were highly stratified, hierarchical societies. They had beliefs in South America, Egypt, and Babylon. They had beliefs that even the spirits and the gods were organized in hierarchical social pyramids. So in those places, when somebody went to, when somebody saw one of these big pyramids, not only was it this big thing, but it was also this big reminder of, their belief that hierarchy was divinely commanded, was divinely sanctioned, that social hierarchy was kind of a natural and sacred thing. Whereas, here again, this one, if there was some person who was in like a leadership position, we would not be able to identify which one of these like little box apartments that person occupied. It does not seem, it does not have any signs of great hierarchy. It doesn't have any signs of anybody having, whatever, any like super amount of material wealth.
The others don't seem to have been designed or capitalized on the natural environment. I mean, they're just off again on their own.
Good, excellent. Wow, yeah, that's great. These are clearly like meant to be disruptive of the environment. They're meant to stand out. They're meant to be really distinctive. And yes, with these 3 pyramids, people had to drag these rocks or these blocks of stone. Whereas with this one, it is kind of nestled inward. We can see that these 3 pyramids, they all orient the eye upward. They're all pointing up there. This one is kind of pointed downward and inward. It is defensible. And the greatest wealth that existed in this cliff city, you might be able to kind of barely see these circles here. Those are presumably places for storing food, for storing corn. So you know, whereas other pyramids, the great wealth would be things like gold and artwork, things that, you know, grave goods. The wealth in the other one is food and water, the basics for survival. Let's think about this for a moment. Somebody came up with this idea. How might somebody have come up with this idea? Where in nature do we see an example of this kind of organization?
Insect.
In the insect world. This cliff city, it bears some resemblance to an ant colony. So we do not know, but it's possible that somebody, what is it? What is it that ants do really, really well? They store up food. We don't know, but it's possible that somebody thousands of years ago said, okay, we're going to make this transition. We're going to go from gathering food to storing food. And they might have looked around and said, who does that really well? Who's really good at storing up food? Somebody might have said, the ants. The ants are really good at storing up food. And somebody might have said, why don't we try out living like that? Human beings apparently did live like that for a while. And then they found that living like the ants wasn't really working out. It just, you know, and the Cliff City was abandoned. There were a lot of these Cliff City experiments. Other people started using irrigation canals and dams. They started doing ceramics, weaving baskets, making cloth out of cotton. Settling down, it enabled people to experiment with more complex crafts and with moving water around. By the time of Rome and Jesus, so this would be about 2,000 years ago, there had developed in the Ohio River Valley a culture of the so-called mound builders. They constructed thousands of enormous sculptures out of earth, sometimes in the shapes of huge humans, birds, or serpents. We have aerial photographs here of some things that were built about 2,000 years ago. Now this conveys, it seems to, I mean, we can only theorize about this time and these people, but it seems that people were trying to communicate with something up in the sky. It seems that there were, you know, ideas that some, you know, greater, higher powers were located up above. Things were created that you can't even really see from a human vantage point. The mound builders seem to have been part of a complex trading system of ornaments and weapons from as far off as the Great Lakes and the far west and the Gulf of New Mexico. Something interesting that we see in North America, starting about 2,000 years ago, is that like raw materials here that have been processed, that have been like carved or processed up here, are suddenly finding their way all the way over to here. We can see from, you know, looking at where the materials originate, that there was a great deal of exchange going on. The rivers of America were used as trade highways. People were finding things, manufacturing things, putting them into boats, moving them up and down and across the country in rivers. The trade goods that are found tend to be concentrated around river deltas, not river deltas, what do they call the place where two rivers cross each other? Anyway, tend to be found at places where the rivers meet, which let us know that these were places where people were settling, that there may have been, I don't know, something like, like trade depots, places where things were collected. Yes.
Is that unique to the North America? Is that different from Europe's river system?
Using rivers as trade highways?
Having a network.
Having it.
Extensive.
Oh, I assume so. That I'm not perfectly certain about. But there was a great deal of trade surrounding the rivers. Think about this for a moment. When the Spaniards came and they built missions, they named a handful of places here after saints. When the English came, they named a handful of places here after locations in England and after English kings, nobles, English stuff. But once we cross the Appalachian Mountains, between the Appalachian Mountains and the old Spanish settlements, a lot of what's here keeps its Native American name. People, essentially, they got tired of arguing with the natives. They got tired of the confusion, and they just knew when somebody got to Missouri, they just said, it's much easier to call it what the natives call it. When we think about North American rivers, again, there are a few rivers that have English or European names. Most of the rivers in North America still have Native American names. And that is because of old Native American trade routes, was that if you were trying to get from one place to another, the people who knew best how to get there by river were the Native Americans. And it became just too logistically difficult to try to have two sets of names, to try to have a native, for the Ohio River or the Allegheny River or the Mississippi River. It just became too challenging to try to remember. Like, when you ask, when you ask at the trade post, they're going to call it like the St. Charles River or whatever. But then when you get lost and you have to ask the natives, they're going to call it the Mississippi. So with North American rivers, still to this day, we almost always use the Native American name. They were just too kind of firmly entrenched from thousands of years of commerce. About 1,500 years ago, this is still 1,000 years before the Europeans arrived. About 1,500 years ago, as the mound builder culture was going into decline, another culture was developing in the Mississippi Valley with advanced agriculture, including thousands of villages, and also earthen mounds and ceremonial places near a vast Indian metropolis that may have had 30,000 people. This is an artist's rendering of what the city there may have looked like. This is a photograph. The largest mound, what we're seeing here is a mountain that was built by human beings. It is a mountain that was built by people carving blocks of dirt and pulling them, moving them to this spot and stacking them on top of each other. The largest mound was 100 feet high with a rectangular base larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. In the city were tool makers, hide dressers, potters, jewelry makers, weavers, salt makers, copper engravers, and magnificent ceramicists. One funeral blanket was made of 12,000 shell beads. To give us a sense of the height of this human-made monument, this down here is an automobile driving past it. To give us the sense of the complexity of this culture, let's take a moment with this detail. One funeral blanket was made of 12,000 shell beads. Let's think about that for a moment. We don't have texts, we don't have documents, we don't even have oral traditions, stories from the culture that did this. But we do have this. We've got the archaeological findings, including this beaded blanket, this funeral blanket. First of all, punching holes in seashells. Let's think about that for a moment. How do you make a hole in a seashell? Has anybody here ever tried that? Or like as a kid, you ever tried to like turn a seashell into a bead? All right, now that's good, good. If we were going to do it and what kind of drill bit? Can you use a metal drill bit to make a hole in a seashell? Maybe, but we would probably need a very, very special. I would think you would need some kind of like sandstone drill bit because, well, what's the seashell going to do? As soon as something presses on it, it's going to crack. How did somebody do this without an electric drill? Yeah, but probably some kind of hand drill. If you were going to hand drill holes in 12,000 seashells, you would probably need about 60,000 seashells. I mean, you know, I would think a lot of them would just shatter, would just crack in half. Somebody learned how to do this. Somebody was apparently really good at it. Probably the person who could do that was not also farming corn. Probably once you found your seashell bead maker, you had them doing just that and training somebody else to do it after them. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Somebody, I mean, presumably somebody would have had to grind it down. Somebody would have to sand it down. These are things they can be done. They sound incredibly difficult and incredibly tedious. I would say if something like that was going to get done, it would have to get done by experts, by people whose job it was to do that. And all for a dead person. Once this thing was made, it got buried. What does that tell us? What does that tell us about what could we infer? What? That's right, that their religion gives them some kind of special veneration, even a worship for the dead. That they think something is really important. That they think something really important happens in the afterlife. That they think that something in the afterlife, either that the dead person is going to need this blanket when they get there, or that something that's out there will be able to identify their importance through this blanket. Whatever it is, here's what I'm going for here. There is a kind of abstraction. It's an abstract belief. When we see human bodies from the Stone Age, and they are buried in the earth in the fetal position, And they've got a couple of tools with them. It's very simple. It's not, I mean, it's not simple. It's a little bit abstract, but we can look at that and we can say, there's clearly some belief that death is in some way connected with gestation and birth. And that there might be some belief in an afterlife where a person might need a couple of tools, where they might need their favorite sharp rock, maybe their spear, something like that. That's pretty easy for us to understand. But then if you were digging in like, like a Viking site from 1,000 years ago, and somebody is buried with like a chariot and with horses that have been killed for the burial, and slaves that have been like killed and buried with them, and they're buried with gold, and they're buried with swords, and they're buried with all this stuff. That's clearly like more. That's more abstract. This the pharaoh burials in the Egyptian pyramids. Like there's something about that. If you're like sucking out somebody's internal organs and putting them into jars, that's really pretty abstract. So the people who did this, they seem to have had kind of complex, abstract beliefs about the afterlife. We don't know what those beliefs were, but we can tell that they thought about it a lot and that they put a great deal of time and resources into it. This burial blanket of beads, this I think was a one-time, like really special thing. But I mean, there were other people who were buried with possessions, with some forms of material wealth. So there does seem to have been a belief in this culture that either that somebody crossing over into life was going to need stuff, or maybe that their leaving stuff behind was only going to cause more problems. If you've got 6 kids and you've got your shell bead blanket, how deciding which one should get it could whatever tear the whole society apart. That these people built this giant mountain. That's clearly a sign of some abstraction. It was probably not a place where people lived. It was probably something that was built for worship, that was built for sacrifice. This, unlike the Cliff City, this has a great deal in common with some of the pyramids of Egypt and Babylon and South America. However, as we'll see in our next session, this, at the height of its use, was mysteriously abandoned. The people who had built it walked away from it. They did not come back. So they seem to have realized in some way that whatever kind of social organization, and probably a hierarchical social organization, but whatever kind of society they were living in that produced this kind of monument and this kind of wealth, it seems that it was not working out for them, and they kind of went off into the woods and started something else. So good, we'll continue from there next month. Do we have any questions so far? Great. All right, well then we'll pick up here in October. Thank you.